In 1976, Anne McDonnell made the sad decision to have her long-absent husband Jim declared deceased so that she could get on with her life. Here's the astonishing story of the man who went missing for 15 years and his miraculous reappearance. Since their marriage in 1960, Anne and Jim McDonnell had lived in a small brick house in Larchmont, a suburb of New York City. Jim had worked as a foreman of mail carriers at the post office for 25 years. The gentle, soft-spoken man was known to hundreds of people in town, and the couple, although childless, were devoted to each other. During February and March 1971, at the age of 50, Jim was subject to an unfortunate string of events. While none was critical in itself, the recurring mishaps seemed to trigger a strange result. While carrying out the garbage one evening, Jim slipped on icy steps, bruising his back and striking his head. A few days later, while driving to work, he suffered a fit of sneezing and lost control of his car, which hit a telephone pole, causing Jim to bang his forehead against the windshield. The next day, a dizzy spell at work saw him tumbling down a flight of steps where he again struck his head. 10 days later, he again hit a pole after losing control of his car. After being found unconscious, he spent 3 days in hospital with a cerebral concussion. On March 29, 1971, Jim had a loan of a friend's station wagon to drive to Kennedy Airport in order to pick up Anne's brother and his family. He then took them to Anne's sister's house, after which he returned the borrowed car at 10 p.m. In doing so, he was unaware that the leather wallet containing his identification had fallen out of his pocket and onto the floor of the station wagon. Jim declined his friend's offer of a ride home, stating that he had a terrible headache and that the walk would help clear his head. Usually, this walk would have taken about 15 minutes. At 11:15 p.m, Anne telephoned the owner of the station wagon, who had no idea why Jim had not yet returned home. It was unlike Jim not to notify Anne if he was delayed. Finally, at 2 a.m, Anne contacted the police and reported her husband missing. After a 24-hour wait, the police issued an all-points bulletin and started writing around 50 letters to Jim's relatives and acquaintances. They followed up every anonymous tip and also checked every unidentified body in New York morgues. Detective George Mulcahy, who was assigned to lead the investigation, knew Jim as the two attended the same church. Mulcahy knew Jim to be a man of integrity and was sure his disappearance had nothing to do with any personal wrongdoing by him. Mulcahy's investigation verified that Jim's private and professional life was impeccable and uncovered neither self-destructive tendencies nor any evidence that he had suffered another accident or even foul play. For Mulcahy, the logical explanation was amnesia, a phenomenon that is still clouded in mystery. While amnesia occurs in some individuals and not others, is open to medical speculation, although it is known that the loss of memory may be caused by stroke, dementia, alcoholism, intense psychological trauma, or by blows to the head. A person whose brain has sustained such injuries can simply wander aimlessly away from their home, with all knowledge of their past experiences obliterated. Anne's sister recalled her walking around the house wringing her hands and praying over weeks. Anne agreed that Jim may be suffering amnesia and worried about his health. Her faith helped her believe that she would find an answer one day as she remained alone in the house waiting. At night, while watching television, she would stare at Jim's favourite overstuffed hassock where he had dozed off in the evenings. She often dreamed he had returned home, only to wake up and realise he still wasn't there. Soon after her husband's disappearance, Anne sought ways to earn a living. She took on babysitting jobs and worked as a supermarket checker and in a hospital cafeteria. In 1977, she began work as a nursing attendant and fell into the habit of taking weekend and holiday shifts so as to keep busy. Trying to live as best as she could through it all, the loyal woman retained her faith that Jim would return. She kept his clothes covered in the wardrobe to protect them from dust, while his razor and can of shaving cream still remained in the bathroom cabinet. Anne stayed living in the same house and kept her telephone listing still under Jim's name. It was unclear what had really happened to Jim during his walk home, except that he had indeed blacked out and lost all memory of who he was and where he lived. It is theorised that he may have taken the train to Grand Central Terminal, then caught another train or a bus south. His next awareness was that he was in downtown Philadelphia, a city he had never even visited before. Carrying no form of ID, Jim observed signs advertising a real estate broker called James Peters and adopted the name James Peters as his own. It never occurred to him to approach a police station or hospital for assistance. Jim had no past, so his only reality was the present. As James Peters, he got a social security card which could then be obtained without showing a birth certificate, and found a job in the cafe of a health club. His next job was at a cancer research institute, cleaning out animal cages, followed by a night shift in a diner where he gained a reputation for his omelettes and good-humoured service. Jim made new friends, joining charity groups and a local church. He never spoke of his past, and his friends didn't pry. One once commented to him that from his accent he must be from New York, to which Jim replied, "I guess so." His friends at the diner found Jim special. At Christmas time, he would play Santa Claus at orphanages, growing a large white beard to fit the part. One waitress at the diner, whose father had died, adopted Jim into her family as a grandfather figure to herself, her husband, and children. Some people naturally wondered about his past, one deciding that he had to be either an ex-priest or an ex-criminal. About a month before Christmas 1985, some noticed that Jim had become unusually quiet and thoughtful, as if turning something over in his mind. On Thanksgiving Day, Jim visited his adopted family and, while watching television where one scene showed a mail carrier, frowned and said, "I think I used to be a postman." He even said that he had started remembering his parents a little. That Christmas Eve, he never arrived for their usual get-together, and his friends stayed up all night waiting for him. On December 22nd, Jim had fallen and knocked his head. The following day at work, he appeared distracted, and late afternoon had another fall, again striking his head. On December 24th, he woke up feeling confused but elated. After nearly 15 years, he knew who he was. That he was James A. McDonnell Jr. of Larchmont, New York, and that his wife's name was Anne. Then suddenly he became scared, wondering if Anne was alive, whether she had remarried, and how she would greet him. Anne had just arrived home from Christmas Mass and had lit candles and prayed for Jim. Light snow was falling outside, and she was in a rush to leave for Christmas dinner at her sister's before the roads became slippery. When the doorbell rang, she felt it an awkward time for a visitor. However, when Anne opened the door and peered at a man with a full white beard, she immediately recognised Jim, although he now looked very thin and, to her eyes, neglected. She was rendered speechless. To Jim, Anne looked even prettier than he remembered. His heart was bursting, while Anne became breathless as if she had been running. They were too stunned to even embrace, which would come later with their tears. Anne took Jim to his favourite seat, the overstuffed hassock, where they began to talk, trying to fill in the gaps in time. For 15 years, Anne McDonnell had lived in limbo, not knowing whether her husband was dead or alive. Both Anne and Jim had earnestly tried to create some kind of new life for themselves without one another. That Christmas, the seemingly impossible had happened, and after a 15-year absence, Jim McDonnell was home at last. The following day, Jim reported his homecoming to the police. That evening, his adopted family in Philadelphia also received a phone call from a reporter telling them Jim was fine. They contacted Jim's friends with the good news. A week after his return, Jim underwent a complete physical, which included a CAT scan of his brain. The conclusion was that he was in normal health. The reunited couple had no problems resuming their lives together. In fact, according to Jim, every day made the time they were apart seem shorter. The reason for Jim's memory loss and its sudden return remains a mystery.